Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us to discuss future skills, hyperreality, and the future of work. My name's Wendy Sukier, and I'm joining you from the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University in Toronto. And with me, I have Tanya Saba, who is with the University of Montreal in Montreal, Sandra Lapointe, who is with McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Jagris Hodson, who is at Royal Roads University in Victoria, BC, and Sunil Johal, who is with the City of Toronto and many other things, also here in Toronto today. Our discussion will start with a presentation by me. Then each of the panelists will have a chance to make some comments and answer some questions. And we hope that you will find this interesting and provocative. So I will begin. I want to talk a little bit about the assumptions around the future of work and skills and some of our findings from preliminary research, as well as a strategy for going forward. One of the things that I think is critically important to talk about is our assumptions about the future. And if you think about it, right up until probably February 2020, the principal future trend that was obsessing everyone was the impact of technology on the future of work. And the Osborne and Frey study, which had proposed that up to 42% of jobs potentially were at risk, and the echo chamber around that research, which had everyone from the OECD to individual countries looking at the impact of the disappearing jobs on their labor forces. What we saw, of course, was that while digitization and the adoption of technology remains a very important consideration, COVID, which was on almost nobody's radar screen, has completely changed our assumptions about the future of work. And the reason why it's important, I think, to raise this is because anyone who says they can predict the future probably is wrong. And we know that very often, while the direction of things like the adoption of new technology is understood, the speed with which it will take hold varies quite considerably. We also saw lots of evidence, and we have over the last 20 years, where we've made assumptions about market trends. There's been enormous focus, for example, ongoing discussion of the shortages of skills in computer science, engineering, and math. And John Roth, the CEO of Nortel, 20 years ago was talking about how critical STEM graduates were for the growth of the technology center. Then we had the dot-com crash, and suddenly people started talking about soft skills, saying technological skills are not the only need. Marketers are harder to find than engineers. And even today, after all of the focus on artificial intelligence, even companies like Microsoft are saying that social sciences and humanities education are critically important, because when you think about it, many of the barriers to the adoption of artificial intelligence have more to do with organizational issues, with consumer behavior. And as we saw with the Sidewalk Labs experiment in Toronto, public policy, consultation, and engagement, the domain of social sciences and humanities. We've also seen that we make assumptions about skills that are very different depending on where we sit. And this is research that was done a number of years ago, where students, recent graduates, were asked where their strengths were. 93% believed they were highly proficient in writing. 91% felt they were highly proficient in oral communication. At the same time, employers had a very different understanding. Just over a third thought they were highly proficient in writing, and under half thought they were good at oral communication. Why the disparity? This had a lot to do with how writing and communication are being defined. Students think they're good at writing essays, and they may very well be. But employers are looking for workers who can write memos, social media, and short reports. So these discrepancies around what the skills are something that continue to plague us. And increasingly, this focus on skills is also the subject of much debate because, for example, OECD recently came out with a report on digital skills, and on the list, they had Excel and they had Java. Well, a Java stack developer is a lot different than someone who can use Excel, and yet they were lumped together as digital skills. One of the things we are focusing on at the Future Skills Center is trying to better understand skills taxonomies, because if skills are the currency for the 21st century, we need common forms of exchange. Similarly, and I don't want to pick on science, technology, engineering, and math, but we hear it over and over about how science, technology, engineering, and math should be the disciplines where we send all of our children and our students. Yet, if you see where the data on employment, the data on salaries, what you will see is that social sciences and humanities graduates actually earn more and have better employment outcomes than, for example, graduates in biology. It's also important to note that disciplines like business and commerce come very close to disciplines like mathematics and engineering. So even the framing of science, technology, engineering, and math, I would argue, is often based on assumptions rather than data or reality. Similarly, the idea that digital skills are really defined as a degree in computer science or engineering is another assumption that we're continually seeing challenged. There's a difference, and of course we need computer science, and of course we need engineers, but one of the biggest demands in the marketplace for digital skills are people who understand the capacity to use technology and its appropriate applications. So we have to make sure that the language is consistent. And I can't let a presentation go by without raising this issue. We've seen much attention being focused on the important role women are playing in leading the battle against COVID, not just across Canada, where most of our chief medical officers are women, but around the world, where the countries that are dealing the best with this tend to be led by women. And yet, when we look at the discussions of recovery, if we look at the discussions of economic growth, if we look at the discussions of innovation, women are completely absent. And what we have seen is a resurgence of what we refer to as manels, meaning panels full of men. And today we have a WAML except for Sunil. The other thing that is critically important from our perspective is this notion that there is a level playing field. One of the things that COVID has done more than anything is laid bare many of the structural inequalities that shape skills and employment in this country. If we look at the impact of COVID on women, it's almost twice what it is in men in terms of the increase in the employment rate and the number of women who have lost their jobs. We also know that when we look at small, medium enterprises, women account for about 16% of them. When we look at self-employment, women are 38%. Yet most of the programs are designed to help us recover from COVID, target SMEs, and therefore exclude women and many other groups. We also know that COVID is a crushing burden on women with children, and the impact of unpaid labor on women is massive in terms of their ability to maintain employment. And then when you layer on intersectionality, when you layer on racialization, when you look at Indigenous people, when you look at people with disabilities and so on, you can see how COVID has exacerbated many of the long-standing disparities that we were able to overlook in the past. The other thing that is critically important from our perspective is this diversity and inclusion lens, and making sure that we recognize very clearly in Canada that many employers who say that they have shortages, who say that they can't find skilled workers, are simply looking in the wrong places. And this becomes clear when we look at the experience of internationally educated professionals, even in highly skilled areas like engineering, where they have much higher rates, double the rate of unemployment that Canadian degree holders have. We also see it in terms of who gets called back for interviews. Two people with identical resumes are treated very differently depending on whether their name sounds Anglo-Saxon or not. In fact, people with a, quote, foreign sounding last name are 40% less likely to be called back for an interview with an SME than someone with an English sounding name. We know that people with disabilities in Canada who have graduated from university have poorer employment outcomes than those who are high school dropouts. We know as well that when we look at the representation of women and racialized minorities, when we look at wage gaps, when we look at who's at the top, there are huge disparities. And our hope is that in thinking about recovery, we will think about inclusive innovation. So I'd like to close by saying when we consider the way forward, we believe that a systems approach is necessary. We need to think about policies, we need to think about infrastructure at the societal level. We need to think about these assumptions about who belongs and who does not belong. At the organizational level, we need far more intentionality around the definition, the measurement, and the assessment of skills. We need to make sure that processes are open and inclusive. And of course, at the individual level, we also have to consider what shapes the choices people make, what shapes the choices that employers make about how they're going to invest and who they're going to hire, but also what shapes the choices that individuals make when they're underemployed, when they face the prospects of losing their jobs. What kinds of nudges can we use to help them pursue additional training and education? Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to a very lively discussion. So at this stage, I would like to turn it over to my colleague Tanya Saba, who is joining us from Montreal.
Yes, well, hello everyone. Thank you. I'm so happy to be part of this panel. I'm going to be sharing my screen and starting my presentation. So I guess you can see it. Yes, okay. So it's about women in the workforce, what the future holds. And I think, Wendy, by following with what you have just presented, I think you will see some of the findings again coming back, but of course with another set, another perspective. So what I'll be presenting in the 10 next minutes, it's an empirical study that I have been conducting, which is still in its earlier stages. And it's a part of a wider project that is twofold, actually. So the first one addresses skill gaps as assessed by workers, and this is what I'm going to be presenting today. The second is going to take the same model, however, address it to employers to understand the skill gaps if we can measure them actually on the labor market. So the project relies on an integrative model that seeks to assess the new skills, so the skills transformation, while studying also the impact of the disruptive technologies on employment, on job families, sectors, and working conditions. So the objective and the particular attention is to look at skills according to the job anatomy. So to look at the sectors, to look at the company sizes, field of education, experience, Also to look at identifying future skills gaps based on job families, workforce characteristics, so that we can have more informed conclusions and not only listing of what the future skills gaps are. Also, and as Wendy was stating, as you can see in an objective, I also echo the studies that suggest that disruptive technologies may increase the prevailing inequalities in the representations of members of vulnerable groups in skilled and some quality jobs. So I'm looking today more specifically at women and age, but in the studies we also are looking at the diversity issues as well, looking at people from disadvantaged backgrounds as well, and looking at the intersectionality effects as well. So the first thing, and I think the most challenging thing in the studying skills gap today, is measuring skills. And again, lots of, I think that we have so much that is written about this. And I have tried, and I've taken, I think, maybe 7 months to do this. And we've ended up with the, if you want, the design that we used comes from ONET, which now, the few months later, I think the Canadian as well had these skills also cartography, which is very interesting. So we have used the 8 skills that are actually go beyond the generic skills and the content skills, which are literacy, numeracy, and being able to use computers in problem solving. And so we have used the cognitive skills, creativity, inductive reasoning, problem sensitivity, etc. Physical skills, I think they don't really need the definition. Content expertise, which is more related to the basic knowledge, the basic skills that we need to develop, like active learning, oral expression, listening, etc. Social skills that are also skills coming from emotional intelligence, negotiation, persuasion, etc. Management skills and resource management skills in general. Process skills, the way that you can control yourself, control processes around you. Systems competencies, judgment and decision-making, system analysis, and technical skills, which is equipment maintenance, looking at quality control, programming, experiencing technology and design, problem solving, computers, and electronics. So what I have used 42 indicators in this study that are grouped in these dimensions. After doing some of the analysis, what I have seen is the need to group together process and management and system and technical skills, which were relating a lot one to another. So the aim of the study today is see what are the differences? How can we explain the skills gap between men and women, and using also age? And according to few of the measures that I've used, and looking at the impact of disruptive technologies on the labor market. So the first thing that if we look at the skills, what we can see in general, and I have 2,900 respondents that answered the first questionnaire, from which 65% are women and 35% are men. So if we look at the skills in general, those that were identified as the less mastered by respondents are technical and system skills. Content, which go back again to some of the basic skills, are the ones that are more mastered on the labor market today. And so you can see a bit just an idea on what are the order of the skills that are available as indicated by the respondents. If I look at the differences between men and women, the first thing that we can see is that cognitive, usually women, which are in pink, on cognitive, on physical, on management and process, and technical and system, they all rate lower in mastering the skills. And if we even look at the content, because of course you have 8 indicators inside the content. So you can see, for instance, that understanding the applications of new information and problem solving and decision making also is rated less for women. Using computer systems rated less for women. Identifying complex problem and review, develop and evaluate options to implement solution also rated less for women. So the thing is, what is the first maybe question that is there is, how come when women in this data set have the same level of education, do consider themselves as having the right skills for the labor market, and rate in general that they have good employment perspective. However, they rate, they master, they say, they perceive their skills as being already lower than men on many, many dimensions. The second, when we look at disruptive technologies and the impact on quality of working conditions, I have looked at the impact on quality of working conditions as rated by the respondents. I have also looked at how difficult, we asked the question, how difficult is it going to be for you to find a job in your field? And the third question was, what proportions of your skills do you feel can be replaced by digital technology or artificial intelligence? So if we look first at the quality of the working conditions, what is very, again, interesting is at the beginning, we see when we're doing the regressions that gender actually is significant. And women do find that the quality of working conditions is going to be affected by disruptive technologies. However, when we put skills into the equation, the gender variable disappears. So what we see is that younger people think that their working conditions are going to be, that are going even to increase, they're gonna be better. Those who have technical and system skills think also that the quality of working conditions are going to increase, and those who have cognitive skills as well. How difficult is it going to find a job? Again, younger people think it's going to be easier for them to find a job, and those with social skills will find it easier. So lots to do with emotional intelligence, etc. Those who think that their skills are going to be replaced by the technology, so we have women more than men then think so. And also older people think so. Those who have technical and system skills also think so. So there is like a realistic way of seeing things. So they have like this, they have the perception that it's really going to happen. However, those who have social and content skill are more confident that their skills are not going to be replaced by the technology. Has technology made your job more demanding? Again, when we start, we see that gender has an effect, and the effect is, again, positive on that. However, again, when we put skills into the equation, gender disappears and age stays. So again, older people, among the respondents, the older one thought that technology was going to make their profession more demanding. And again, those who master technical and system skills also have like a greater awareness that the technology is going to make their profession more demanding. Those with management and process skills as well, those with social and emotional intelligence skills think that they're gonna be okay. So we have asked 3 questions just to see what are the real perception, how far would they go in thinking or in perceiving how much technology is going to really replace and have an impact on their working conditions. So we asked the respondents, do you think that doctors will rely on computer programs to diagnose most diseases and determine treatments? Well, women were less convinced that that was going to happen. Men were convinced that that was going to be the case. Older people as well. And those with cognitive and technical and system skills thought this was going to happen. When we asked if all stores are going and retail businesses are going to be fully automated, it's younger people that thought that this is what's going to happen. Again, technical and system skilled people thought so as well. Those with physical, those who saw that the less they had physical abilities, they thought that was going to happen, and less with social skills. If we look at are all the deliveries going to be done by robot, again, women were more skeptical about this. However, men more, and technical and system skills as well. So when people want to buy most common products, they will create them at home using a 3D printer. Again, it's all respondents with more technical and system skills that thought that was going to be the case. So in the 2 seconds that I think I have left, maybe just few conclusions. The first one is really there is a disconnect between the rhetoric and the perception in the field. Like if we look a bit at the percentages, you can see that, you know, people still think that there's going to be a slight increase, even a strong increase in the quality of working conditions. However, provided that you have the right skills. And again, in difficulty to find a job, 26 of them thinks much easier. However, 49% state that it's going to be about the same. And are your skills going to be replaced? So you can see that people are not really into this. They don't think that it's going to happen really from one day to the other. So what's happening in those with technical and system skill, cognitive skills, and the younger people are still those who are more worried than others about what's happening. Women are in a very sensitive situation. Although we're not sure what they really do believe. However, we know that they rate lower on practically all the skills. And I think, and if you look at the social skills, this is where sometimes on few indicators they rate higher, but it's again on things like the negotiating, the feelings, taking care of others, taking care of the feelings of others, and not on any of the systems, mathematical resources, evaluations, etc. Items. And what's happening is in a recent study on small businesses owned by women, we could see that the digital shift came first when we asked women about the avenues that they were seeking to get through the crisis. So again, we look at this gap. So who should be taking care of it? Clearly, it's not an individual matter. Clearly, it has to be employers matter. It has to be a government. It has to be public agencies that have to really grasp and look at these gaps and see how through education, experience, we can develop them further. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. I'm laughing because in terms of the self-assessment of people's skills, when you ask men and you ask women, are they good at math, are they good at English? I'm reminded of the study that has been done on standardized testing of children in grade 3, where when you look at the tests, women or little girls outperform little boys in both English and in mathematics. But when you ask them, are you good at English? Are you good at mathematics? Little boys are more likely to say yes. So I think when we look at some of these self-reported results, we have to take into account those gendered confidence gaps and so on. Before we move on to Sandra, I wonder if you could just answer maybe one question, Tanya, and Tell us about sectoral differences. Did you see differences between the services industry, for example, and manufacturing, or in the other sectors that you considered?
Well, so far, yes. And I think what is, it's very important first is to see where women are. So they are more represented in certain sector, like in education, in health, in retail. However, in this case, we had the level of education which had no differences. And I think that we need to look at the sectors, and especially where we can find differences, it's in the size of the organization, where some of the basic needed skills, like the technical and system skills and management skills, are being more developed in a smaller organization than in larger one, probably because in larger one you get to do a job and maybe a more specified job, and in a smaller organization you get to, you know, to touch on more than one issue. And I think that this is really very interesting to see how does the field develop some of the needed skills and the future skills, and of course to, you know, mix them with what educations, schools, colleges, university, etc. need to develop as well.
Thanks so much. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Jagris Hodson from Railroads University. Over to you, Jagris.
Thank you, Wendy. It's great to be here. You know, as the other panelists have mentioned, I think it's really important to take a systems view of some of the issues of diversity. And so today my presentation is going to talk about organizational barriers to women in a digital age. And we're going to adopt that sort of ecological model of different barriers that impact women entrepreneurs as we are digital and as we are increasingly going digital in a time of COVID. Now, importantly, most of this research has stemmed from a comprehensive literature review that my team has conducted, looking specifically at the barriers to women entrepreneurs in ICT in Canada. So I'll be discussing some of my other empirical research here, but this is also the result of an extensive literature review that we've conducted. Now, in some ways, we know that digital technologies have been very liberating as a force for women. For example, we know things about the Occupy movement, Idle No More, women's marches. These have all been really well documented, and they wouldn't be possible without the connectivity afforded by digital technologies. However, we also know, and what much of the work at the Future Skills Center has revealed, is that the battle is not yet over for women. So in order to fully participate in this digital revolution, women still need to overcome, and non-binary people as well, still need to overcome tremendous organizational barriers at every level of the system. There's an ecology of intersecting forces, from the cultural and international or global forces, through policy levels, down through organizations, and then personal or interpersonal. And each of these forces presents unique barriers for women entrepreneurs. So starting with the global. Now we know that more women globally are operating businesses in sectors, so-called pink sectors, like personal care, fashion, food service, etc. This has been well documented by the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and the OECD recently. So this means that for many women-owned businesses around the world, they were already in sectors that were undervalued, and COVID has only increased that problem, creating not only a mental health crisis for people, but very real financial impacts. Now, this is also an issue when we look at urban versus rural, right? So, rural businesses already prior to COVID had to contend with small dispersed customer bases, technical barriers like a differing access to broadband. And globally, we can also see this digital divide playing a real role. In Canada, we've identified rural economic development as part of the key to prosperity, but we're not there yet. And there are many communities that still, for example, need more broadband. And of course, now that people are going online and recognizing their businesses need to go online, this need has become even more enhanced. And particularly for women who are trying to juggle many things, including education for their kids that may be online, and maybe growing their own businesses. And while, you know, government programs, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, provide support to small and medium enterprises to a greater extent than other countries, there's still definitions of who gets to be counted as an entrepreneur. So there's structural barriers such as eligibility definitions that we have identified at the Diversity Institute. And then finally, cultural differences about a woman's place and how much time she should spend on her family versus growing her business can be either implicitly or explicitly supported by interpersonal interactions and government policy. And this is discussed in the most recent report by the Diversity Institute. Women entrepreneurs can't be what they can't see. So we know that women in diverse leadership have issues when it comes to getting the same access to different policies that could help them. So in Canada, for example, we have different policies over what counts as an entrepreneur. Does, you know, a sole-owned private business count as an entrepreneur? Do you need to have employees? You know, what happens if you're an artisan? Are you considered an entrepreneur? Do you have access then to the funding and things that you need, right? So policies around access to EI, access to childcare, access to funding, are all issues that our literature review has revealed can be barriers that specifically affect women, non-binary, and diverse entrepreneurs more than they affect the white male entrepreneurs. And then, of course, policies around tech. So work at the Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub has recognized that women who work in tech-focused industries such as e-commerce, e-marketing, you know, influencers or online education, they're not always counted as quote unquote tech entrepreneurs because of these definitions. So they're not eligible for the same support. And, you know, policies about who has access to education and support for women in STEM can absolutely impact whether women see a future in that or whether they have access to those programs. Now, platforms too create unique barriers. So for example, women and non-binary individuals and people in cultural or racial minorities tend to be more subject to online harassment. And this has a silencing effect that keeps women from feeling like they can promote themselves and their businesses online. Now, Sathya Noble, who wrote the book Algorithms of Oppression, also noticed that algorithms, and particularly search algorithms, favor you know, certain ideas. So for example, if you search entrepreneur or you search leader, you're more likely to get images of white men than you are to get images of diversity. And again, this comes back to a whole cultural issue of women can't be what they can't see. Algorithms also drive this prevalence of online harassment. Online harassment is very engaging. It drives clicks, it drives, you know, reactions. And that's often what feeds the business model of platform companies. And so that means that it is much harder to be out in the world as a woman trying to grow your business than it is to, say, you know, again, be a white man, for example. And then finally, there are barriers at the personal level or interpersonal barriers. Women still are responsible for the majority of care in the home. And preliminary data analyzed by Fuller and Kian at UBC have shown that women have faced the worst of the economic consequences of COVID-19 so far. And of course, since the COVID-19 lockdown, the employment gap just keeps widening with women dropping out of the workforce to do more care in the home. So until we figure out these barriers, which are of course related to some of the cultural barriers discussed earlier, women will not have the same access to the ability to grow their business. And in turn, we can see that all of these factors are working together to create an overarching barrier that just simply makes it tougher for women to engage in entrepreneurship and to benefit from the technologies that could help them grow their businesses. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Jagris. And I was really, I was very pleased that you raised the definitions issue because, for example, when we look at the innovation superclusters, so much of the focus is on STEM. You know, we talked about how that has unintended consequences. And even if you look at your, you know, the BC-led digital supercluster, the focus is very much on companies that make the make the software, make the pipes, make the engines of the digital economy, and so little is focused on the people who use those networks to actually create wealth. And the example I always cite is, Kylie Jenner, I think one of Kendall, one of the Jenners, the first billionaire under the age of 20, made her billions using Shopify as her platform. And yet she would not be considered part of the digital supercluster. So thank you for raising that. You talked about platform algorithms. You talked about how the very design of technologies can exclude women. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that and some of the opportunities there might be to reverse those trends. How would we actually fix it?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. And I mean, the number one trend that people have noticed, and that shows up in my research as well, is this idea that the people designing the technology are all very uniform, right? They come from similar backgrounds, they come from similar schools, they're hiring more people that look like them. And so when they're designing, algorithms that filter social media content, or when they're designing, algorithms that maybe recognize our faces or voices or those sorts of things, they're designing for a very specific kind of person, that is more people that look like them. So the number one thing that we need to do is find new ways to make those workplaces more welcoming for diverse bodies, so that we can get more diverse people designing the technology. Now, as you noted, rightly, women are doing very well in school. We've got programs to channel women into STEM. And so the issue isn't necessarily the pipeline, but once they get into those organizations, the culture of the organization is very exclusionary, and often women drop out and they'll, choose family over work. Maybe it's because they really want to be at home with the family, but maybe it's because the workplace isn't so welcoming. So if we can find ways to gradually shift the culture of these workplaces to make them truly welcoming of diversity, then we can keep the people in the pipeline, in the organizations. They'll be in turn responsible for developing technologies that are more welcoming to diverse people.
And I just, I can't let go of the fact that yesterday we released our latest Diversity Leads report, and the intersectional issues are so much with me as a result of having done that. And especially not just the data, which showed that out of, well over 1,000 corporate board members, we found 13 who were Black in all of the Canadian cities we looked at. But even more troubling was some of the qualitative research around the experience of people who have dimensions of identity that they can choose to disclose or reveal. So if you're a biological woman, or if you are Black, it's often difficult not to be identified as a woman or as Black, although there are some exceptions. But when we talked to many other groups, there were just terrible stories. I mean, there was the man who worked on Bay Street who told people he was a recovering alcoholic rather than reveal he was Muslim. There were people, one of the people we spoke to afterwards, Colin Druin, who's the head of Out on Bay, said that the advice that he was given by his queer mentors was not to identify until he was so well placed that they couldn't fire him without someone noticing. And that inability to bring your full self to work for people who have disabilities, for people who are LGBTQ2+, for people with different religious observations, and even for some Indigenous people, I think is something we really have to grapple with in a very serious way. So that brings us to our next speaker, Sunil Johal. Would you like to introduce yourself and then make a few remarks? Sunil.
Would have been nice to be in Vancouver, but obviously joining you from my backyard, and my sprinkler system has decided to go on right now. So hopefully you can hear me over the sounds of the water. So my day job, I'm the Director of Business Growth Services at the City of Toronto. And for the past 4 or 5 months, I've been focusing on the COVID pandemic as Director of Economic Support and Recovery with the city. I'm also a fellow with the Brookfield Institute and the Public Policy Forum, and formerly was Policy Director at the Mowat Center at the University of Toronto. So I'm going to build on a lot of the remarks that my terrific panelists have made, co-panelists have made before me, and just probably take a little bit more of a policy lens and focus my remarks on that aspect of my presentation. So I'm just going to pull up the share screen button here at some point if I can. Give me a second. And here we go. So very quickly, I was asked to talk a little bit about the impact of disruptive technologies on women in the labor market. Starting at the most broad level, as Wendy pointed out at the opening, this conversation around disruptive technologies, the impacts of artificial intelligence, advanced robotics on jobs has been going on for 4 or 5 years, probably in earnest now. And we have seen, and this chart shows you for US labor market, the story is pretty much exactly the same for the Canadian labor market. What's been happening with job growth in different categories? So routine versus non-routine jobs, cognitive and manual. From 1983 to 2014. So key point here is obviously there have been significant advances in AI since 2014 and advanced robotics. So some of these trends have even potentially accelerated since then. But basic message being non-routine jobs, those bottom 2 lines, those top 2 lines are the ones that are seeing steady growth. Red, non-routine cognitive jobs, and the very bottom line, non-routine manual jobs. Those, the top and bottom lines, non-routine jobs, are where our economy has been seeing significant job growth. Routine jobs, whether cognitive or manual, have been stagnating or actually even seeing a bit of a fall off in recent years. And then when we think about jobs of the future, and again, there have been dozens of reports around this and skills and all of these topics. General consensus seems to be that industries such as education, health, nursing tend to be at a lower risk of automation. More complex, non-routine, kind of interpersonal elements to those positions. So they're probably a little bit safer. But what I wanted to mostly speak about here was the impacts of COVID on the labor market, on women, and what we might want to think about doing about some of those issues. So coming into kind of the summer now, coming out of COVID, the first wave of COVID here in Canada, we know that women's labor market participation is at its lowest level in 3 decades. RBC recently published a report noting that 45% of the decline in hours worked over the downturn is attributed to women, but they'll only make up about 35% of the recovery. We know there's a significant wage gap. About 13% in 2018 between men and women. We also know that women have a higher proportion of positions in the service sector, about 55%. And as Armin, Yanizian, and others have noted, this is a service sector downturn or recession. A she-cession, as Armin often refers to it. So as opposed to a kind of quote unquote traditional recession, which is led by the goods producing sector and which sees economic stimulus flow to infrastructure and trying to get men back to work. In this case, we're actually seeing sectors like tourism, hospitality, food services be hit really hard by COVID. First to get hit and probably the last to recover in many cases. And what's also important to note is even in the industries where there's a good mix of both men and women, we tend to see women be at lower levels of wages in some of those industries. For example, if you look at something like accommodation and food services, Majority of chefs and cooks were men, but more women are food counter attendants, kitchen helpers, related support personnel. And if you think about what's happening with restaurants right now, I mean, who's still working for the most part? It's the cooks, the back of house staff, the servers and the cashiers are often the ones who have been laid off. I mean, that's starting to turn around a little bit as we progress through new stages of recovery, but women are the ones who are being hit particularly hard here. And then obviously there's the childcare challenge. How do we make sure that we've got a functional childcare system and education system back in place by the fall so that women can get back to work? They're disproportionately bearing the burden of childcare, we know, and they're going to disproportionately bear the burden of a recovery plan that doesn't include childcare and education at the forefront of those plans. So I mean, a couple of charts here. This one from Mikhail Skudarud from University of Waterloo. Change in aggregate hours worked by paid employees in the early stages of the downturn. You can see that hourly paid women, significant drop off, more so than hourly paid men. Salaried women, again, more of a drop off than we see amongst salaried men in terms of those aggregate hours worked over that time period. And then David McDonald from CCPA also had a really interesting chart from that same February to April time period, looking at percentage of workers who lost their jobs or the majority of hours by wage level. And obviously significantly more people in lower wage jobs have lost either their jobs or a significant amount of hours. And as mentioned earlier, lower paid jobs tend to have a higher proportion of women than higher paid jobs. I mean, this is certainly a gendered downturn, a gendered economic impact. So what do we do about this? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because hopefully we can talk about it in the discussion. But as Jagris mentioned, I mean, a lot of our structural programs like EI, like social assistance, childcare, I wouldn't say intentionally, but they do kind of have the end result of discriminating against women. So a program like EI, women tend to not have as many standard employment opportunities. They're disproportionately going to be excluded from EI. That means they're also going to be excluded from skills training programs that are going to be particularly important as the economy undergoes a seismic shift and digitizes, and certain sectors shrink and other sectors grow. We're going to need to make sure we're training people for those new opportunities. And if women, racialized minorities, new immigrants, young people can't access skills training through the public system, they probably don't have enough wages in many cases to pay for it themselves. Their employers, if they have one, aren't going to pay for it, so they're going to be left behind. I mean, we should look at things like wage transparency in addition to some of those structural changes. So how do we bring sunshine on to issues like the gender pay gap, let people know who's making what at a particular firm or in a particular industry, equip women with better information with which to bargain a starting wage or salary increases. Boosting the minimum wage would be obviously something of significant impact for low wage earners. We've kind of had this experience of pandemic pay and premiums for folks working in grocery stores and others. If they're that important to us when we most needed them, should we not treat them as they are important coming out of the pandemic, or hopefully coming out of the pandemic at some point soon? So I mean, I think we need to start looking at a whole range of different policy instruments. I don't think there's a silver bullet here. If we just do this one thing, that will address the gendered impacts of the COVID downturn. I think it's going to be significant efforts on all fronts, at all levels of government, private sector, nonprofit sector, individuals, businesses coming to the fore as well. But I think it's something that if we don't do it, we're going to be digging out of this hole with one arm tied behind our back. I mean, we need to make sure women are able to re-enter the labor market, and we need to make sure that they're in positions where they can earn an equitable wage. So I'll stop there, recognizing we don't have a lot of time left, and I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Sunil, that was terrific. And I'm going to steal that, digging ourselves out of this hole with one arm tied behind our back, I think is a absolutely perfect analogy for the nature of the challenge we see ourselves in. And I just wanted to underscore all of those things you talked about with respect to structural inequality, and the concentration of women, for example, in more precarious, lower paid jobs and so on, apply equally to racialized people, to Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and so on. So again, just, we're focusing this discussion specifically on gender, but just want to highlight that all of those issues apply to other underrepresented groups. And then when you have that intersectionality, it becomes overwhelming. I think you've already talked a little bit about some of your ideas around policy, but maybe you could talk a bit more about what you think governments should be doing in order to address some of those inequalities you mentioned about, for example, access to subsidized training or childcare. Like what's as the policy guru on the panel, what are your kind of top 5 recommendations? Can you talk about those in a bit more detail?
Sure. I mean, I think first thing I'll say, just kind of as an overarching point for any policy area we're looking at, and I will give credit to the federal government on this, they're doing a much better job in the past couple of years, I would say, on the GBA, gender-based analysis work. So, I mean, in their recent, I think they call it economic snapshot, you had pages and pages of detail about how different interventions will impact certain target populations, so whether women or other groups. And I think just having that understanding is critical. I mean, if we don't kind of go into this knowing who's going to benefit or who's not going to benefit, more importantly, from policy changes, we're really operating in the dark here. So I really encourage federal government to continue doing that, provincial governments, which have a huge role in this policy space, to kind of pick up on that work as well, make sure they're kind of figuring out, okay, from a distributional perspective, who's winning, who's losing from these changes, and how do we make sure there are more winners than losers, and those folks who most need the help are getting it. And I think we are getting better and better at that. In terms of specific policy areas, I mean, I mentioned childcare and education. I mean, those are probably the most pressing. I mean, we're coming up on September in 3 weeks, back to school. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of different provinces' back to school plans not being robust enough in terms of making sure kids have social distance, investing enough money to make sure there's enough PPE and other types of supports in the system to make sure teachers are safe as well, which we have to think about, which is another area where we've got a lot of women working who we want to make sure we're looking after our teachers, both men and women. So I mean, I think that's the key priority, and we need to make sure if the provinces aren't or can't do this on their own for some reason, I mean, the federal government's got to come in and backstop that. I mean, if we don't have childcare up and running in September, the economy is going to grind to a halt. Again, full stop. Skills training, I think, is absolutely vital, as well as a third area that we need to look at. I kind of outlined some of the reasons why there, but I mean, I think we don't quite appreciate how much certain sectors are going to transform in the next 2 to 3 years if this continues for another 6 or 8 or 10 months. I mean, we're not going to go back to business as normal at that point. So how do we make sure we are equipping people with the skills to move from hospitality into another sector, or e-commerce, or what have you? And how are we making sure that organizations like Future Skills Center and others are assessing what interventions work and are effective at training people for new opportunities and getting that information out into the hands of post-secondary institutions and other service providers. EI is critical as well. I mean, lots of people are going to be probably cycling in and out of work over the coming months. We know the federal government has talked about reforms to EI, introducing a parallel program for self-employed and gig workers. The details of that are going to be critical. I mean, the CERB has been a really great initiative to kind of keep a lifeline for folks going, but that lifeline is being withdrawn. So we need to make sure that people don't drop off a cliff when the lifeline is being withdrawn. That mixes about 20 metaphors, but I think you get my point. And then, I mean, if we were to pick a fifth one, I mean, I think the mental health aspects of this pandemic cannot be underappreciated. So how do we make sure our Medicare system is supporting everybody, I mean, everybody for sure, but I mean, children, women, folks who have lost jobs, racialized groups, new immigrants who are just going through kind of an unbelievable amount of stress and distress through this situation. And I think you may get your job back, but this psychological turmoil of 6, 12, 18 months is not going to go away. So how do we make sure we're putting people in the best position to thrive for the rest of their lives and the rest of their working careers going forward? So I would really love to see some more focus and attention on those mental health supports as well.
Thanks for that. And I really, I think it is important for us to really think of this not just as, a plague that has been cast upon us, but also as an opportunity to innovate. Necessity is the mother of invention. And if you look at the pace with which organizations that previously said, oh, we couldn't do that, or we couldn't do that, or that will never work, who simply transformed themselves over a weekend, I think that really tells us there is a great opportunity. And I was glad you really focused in on the issues around schooling and childcare, because I think again there are huge opportunities for innovation, for thinking about different approaches that I read in the paper today, for example. They're putting a lot of emphasis on outdoor education, perhaps more physical education. My colleague, Lauren McNamara, who runs the Recess Project, has been arguing that especially with little kids, they should be focusing far more on play, outdoor activities, and so on in the transition period. We've launched with the Ontario Tech University a free tutoring service for marginalized populations, because when you think about it, someone like me is quite well equipped to ensure that my child is properly homeschooled and that they have the tutors and the supports that they need. Someone who speaks English as a second language and has themselves limited education, like some of the Syrian refugees, for example, we sponsored, much less equipped to help their child in a homeschooled or hybrid environment, which seems to be what we're going to be facing. So I do think this also presents an enormous opportunity for really thinking out of the box and questioning why we've always done things the way that we've done and embracing innovation. I see that Sandra Lapointe has joined us, and I wonder, Sandra, if you would like to make a few remarks before we wrap up the session.
I think this session will need some editing. I might actually try to make a few points just because I think that they're important. And let me share my screen. What I really wanted to talk about in this discussion around gender diversity and disparities is the role that social science and humanities can play. And the reason why I think it's important is because the import that social science and humanities can have is, I think, systematically undervalued. Wendy was talking a little bit earlier about the various causes and reasons for the fact that women are less present in the workforce, or present but in a smaller proportion. And if there are ways in which the social science and humanities can help, it's precisely because it is only by mobilizing social science and humanities knowledge that we can address these various challenges. But there's also another way in which social science and humanities can play a role in redressing the disparities, and this might sound a little bit odd, but it is by channeling social science and humanities graduates in leadership positions in the industry. If we're looking at societal issues, organizational issues, or individual factors that underpin the fact that there's a lack of equity between the genders, those are all aspects of research that can be addressed by the social science and humanities. And that's something that is, I think, obvious. The point that I want to focus on is really the second point. Why am I saying that easing access to leadership position for social science and humanities might be a way to address the gap? Well, it's because I'm only running like a very simple algorithm here. There are more women in social science and humanities program. And so by creating smoother career pathways for social science and humanities graduates, where there is a greater number of women, then we actually make it easier, at least statistically, for women to access positions of leadership. And you can see these disparities very clearly when you look, and this is just the 2016 Statistics Canada data. You can see the disparities between men and women if you divide them between the STEM and the business, humanities, arts, social science, and education. There's a much larger number of women in these fields. If you break down, and here I've just taken a few different fields, specific fields, where the women are in green and the men are in purple. You can see that there are, again, a very big difference. The numbers are practically reversed between the social science and humanities fields that are on the left and the STEM fields that are on the right. And what's really interesting, and this is something that came up a little bit earlier in discussion, is that in the biological science, this is the only field where there's more women than men. But this is also, and this is what I think Wendy was mentioning, this is also the field where women are the least well paid in the STEM. So the question that if we're right to think that increasing the number of social science and humanities graduates that access leadership position would actually increase the number of women that access leadership position, then the question is, how do we make that happen? And of course, it's a complex question, but certainly there's one way in which work integrated learning and experiential learning is set to help any graduate find it easier to transition into the workplace. And the reason for this is that work integrated learning and experiential learning in general helps students foster the skills, develop the skills that they need in order to meet employers' expectation. Here I'm presenting just the result of a survey of the literature that we did, where we were trying to understand the perceived needs of employers in terms of the skills that they need. And so you can think of innovation, adaptability, communications, ethics. This is just the regular, there's nothing very new, but if it is the case that work integrated learning not only helps students foster those skills, but also provide them with an opportunity to explore potential places of employment, then this is what we need to aim for in order to help social science and humanities students transition. Now, the problem is that most models for work integrated learning, experiential learning, applied research are focused on STEM models. So what we need to do in order to help students in the social science and humanities acquire the skills that they need is to develop more SSH focused professional and research development programs. So this is in part what the collaborative has been doing. It's an extremely difficult challenge. The reason why it's a difficult challenge is because when we're thinking about experiential learning, we're thinking what we need are outlets for internships. We need outlets for internships. We need outlets for any kind of applied research. And when it comes to the social science and humanities, these outlets are harder to find than in the STEMs. The reason for this is that the sort of public sector or even private sector outfit that are going to be interesting for social science and humanities students are usually smaller, and hence a little bit less well equipped to welcome them for the purpose of an experiential learning opportunity. So the challenge in developing these meaningful work integrated learning opportunities is quite high and requires that we look at the needs of the potential outlets for experiential learning opportunities, but also at the best way to build partnerships between campus and communities in doing that. So I'm not sure that I've been doing a very good job at keeping track of time, but this was basically the few comments that I wanted to make.
Sorry, that was terrific and really addresses many issues close to our hearts. I know Jagris and Tanya have, and I, along with Sunil, have discussed these for a long time. I wonder if you have, are there any models, like are there any initiatives that you've seen that can advance some of the things that you have proposed in terms of both making social sciences and humanities departments perhaps more aware of what the opportunities are to transition their graduates into employment, or programs that you've seen that create these work integrated learning opportunities for SSH grads?
Well, so there are, of course, already programs that exist that are quite successful. So for instance, MyTax offers a lot of opportunities to students across all sectors. However, when you look at what are the specific needs and interests of students in the social science and humanities, what you discover is that the existing programs that are open to all disciplines do not fit especially well with the kind of constraints that these students experience. So for instance, a student in an undergraduate student or graduate student in the social science and humanities, and this is what our research has shown, is going to be less interested in interrupting their studies to go in the workforce for a whole semester. What they would prefer to have is a much more flexible approach to having interactions with the not-for-profit sector. So how do you develop models? Well, of course, as you know, the Collaborative, which is a McMaster-based initiative, has been looking at incubating and developing these kinds of experiential learning opportunities as part of fellowships for graduate students, precisely because that is the sort of model that will make it possible for them to manage their studies while at the same time opening themselves to employment in the not-for-profit sector. But there's also the policy sector, the education sector. I mean, the reason for work integrated learning or community service learning or internships or applied research are often the same. You want to provide the student with an insight into a field or into a workplace that is accessible to them, but might not be traditionally the sort of workplace that they would endeavor to seek. But it's also at the same time a way for students to hone in on the skills that they need to be successful in these jobs. And so, I mean, so the argument for the social science is the art in the context of the discussion that we're having, is that there are a much larger proportion of women who are in the programs. And by making it possible for social science, and hence for more women to have access to these work integrated learning opportunities, well, you're solving the problem upstream, and
Yep.
hopefully fostering a more diverse workplace.
I think those are great points. And again, I'll say the same thing to you that I said to Sunil, which is not only do these points apply to women, but if you do the analysis of social sciences and humanities students, what you will find is that's where most of your Indigenous students are, that's where most of your Black students are, that's where most of your students with disabilities are. So if the government says that it is committed to providing opportunities for underrepresented groups and to leveling the playing fields, if it focuses on STEM, it has the unintended consequences of excluding those groups. And of course, you're also aware that the Future Skills Center has invested heavily in programs like the Advanced Digital and Professional Training Program, which is designed to help social science and humanities graduates transition into work by providing work integrated learning opportunities either during the summer or right at the end of their studies, which is often a really important place for that to happen. So thank you very much. I think we're pretty much out of time, and I am so appreciative for all of you participating. My final remarks really are to underscore the fact that to address the issues around the future of work and skills, we really have to start with the evidence rather than just repeating a lot of truisms. And I'm very grateful to the group today for highlighting where the research takes us on some of this. I think as well, we need to make sure that we apply a gender and diversity lens to everything that we're doing when we're looking at impacts, when we're looking at opportunities, when we're looking at who benefits from what programs and policies and services. That's an absolutely critical perspective to have. We need to, in my view, really focus in on some of the things Tanya was speaking of with respect to, and Sandra as well, with respect to really trying to identify what we mean when we say skills, how we are going to measure those skills and how we're going to develop those skills, and what works and what doesn't work, as opposed to making assumptions. And we've seen, quite tragic results, for example, of our investments in English as a second language programming, which, the Auditor General has shown in most cases doesn't produce any better results than if you just put a newcomer into a work experience. And there's lots of interesting opportunities, I think, to experiment with new approaches. One of the things we're very passionate about is thinking about entrepreneurship training and opportunities, not as producing entrepreneurs, but as developing essential skills and providing experiential learning opportunities to build confidence and new understanding and transferable skills that can help people transition into employment. We really have to work hard, and everyone on the call works in post-secondary institutions. And so you know what I mean when I say there's just too much fragmentation, too much duplication, and too little focus on evaluation and evidence-based decisions. And so you see a lot of not invented here at many universities, and rather than taking a model or an approach that has been used elsewhere, they have to start from scratch. And that's one of the big things the Future Skills Center is trying to do is develop more horizontal collaboration around sharing and curating new programs, new technologies, new approaches. And I know that the collaborative is very much focused on that. And I think Jagris's comments are so important about how when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're not just talking about how many of these and how many of those there are represented. We're talking about how we're engaging with diverse people at every stage of the organization and the development of processes, and especially when it comes to the design and delivery of new products and services, and really making sure that we don't make assumptions about the neutrality of new technologies, because the evidence is very clear they're anything but neutral. And I'll just really underscore the point that Sunil made, which is we have an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity to rebuild and to rebuild better. And as has been said, there will be no recovery without the she-covery, and we need to really keep gender and diversity issues central to our discussions of the way forward. And that means also ensuring women are at the table when those decisions are being made about policies and priorities. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much to the Future Skills Center for its support.